The mansion stood isolated on the edge of the city, a towering relic of old money and whispered secrets. The air was thick with the scent of whiskey and cigars, blending with the tension that had been building for hours. Inside, 5 men sat around an ornate poker table, their eyes scanning the green felt, the stacks of chips, and, most importantly, each other. This was no ordinary poker game. It was high stakes, not just in money, but in pride, grudges, and silent threats exchanged through glances. Then, at exactly midnight, something went terribly wrong. A deafening bang shattered the tense silence. A chair toppled over. Richard Langley, the host and wealthiest man in the room, slumped forward, his last poker hand still clenched in his fingers. His lifeless body lay motionless against the table. The doors were locked, the weapon was missing, and every single man in that room had a motive. The game had started like any other. A private invitation, an expensive bottle of bourbon, and the same exclusive guest list. Richard Langley, the billionaire host, known for his ruthless business tactics and secret debts. Thomas Grayson, a former partner turned enemy, left bankrupt by Langley's shady deals. Daniel Marks, a gambler who owed Langley more than he could repay. Leonard Shaw, a corporate lawyer with a grudge against Langley's empire. Vincent Hale, the quietest of the group, a man who had lost something far greater than money. They all had a reason to hate Langley, but who had the courage to do something about it? Langley smirked as he tossed a handful of chips into the center. "Come on, gentlemen. Don't get shy on me now. What's a few thousand more?" Thomas tightened his grip on his cards. His face was unreadable, but his eyes burned with old resentment. Daniel, sweating under the dim light, hesitated before calling the bet. His hands trembled slightly as he pushed his last stack forward. Leonard exhaled, his mind somewhere far beyond the game. He didn't trust Langley. None of them did. But tonight, something felt even more dangerous than usual. Vincent sat back, silent, his expression almost too calm. He barely touched his drink, barely spoke. Langley grinned, relishing the power he had over them. Then he revealed his hand. 4 aces and a king. The perfect hand. And at that moment, the lights flickered. A loud bang echoed through the room, and Langley fell forward, lifeless. The room fell into absolute chaos. Thomas leaped from his seat, knocking over his chair. Daniel gasped, his face drained of all color. Leonard froze, his mind racing for an explanation. Vincent remained still. Too still. Langley's body lay motionless, his cards still clenched between his fingers. The glass of whiskey beside him had not been touched. There was no gun, no blood, no sign of struggle. The doors were still locked from the inside. It was as if he had simply stopped living. And yet, every single man at that table knew one thing. This was no accident. The seconds after Langley collapsed felt like an eternity. No one moved. The flickering chandelier above cast eerie shadows across the table, making the moment feel surreal. Then, Thomas was the first to break the silence. "Check his pulse." Leonard hesitated, then leaned forward and pressed 2 fingers against Langley's neck. Nothing. "He's gone," Leonard muttered, his voice strained. Daniel let out a shaky breath, his hands gripping the edges of the table as if the world beneath him was tilting. "But how? There's no weapon, no sign of struggle." Vincent remained silent, his eyes fixed on Langley's body. One of them had to be responsible, but how could anyone have done it? Without a weapon. The doors were still locked from the inside, the only windows in the room were bolted shut. No one had gotten up from their seats when it happened. And yet, Langley was dead. Then, from the hallway, footsteps echoed. A knock on the door. "Mr. Langley? Everything all right in there?" "The butler." The 4 men exchanged looks, their minds spinning. If they opened that door, this wasn't just a poker game anymore. It was a crime scene. Leonard stepped forward and unlocked the door. The butler, an older man with sharp eyes, entered and immediately froze at the sight of Langley's motionless body. A single moment of silence. Then, "I'll call the police." The detective arrives. 20 minutes later, the room was swarming with investigators. The lead detective, a woman in her late 40s with sharp features and an even sharper gaze, stepped into the room. Her name was Detective Evelyn Carter, and she was known for solving cases that made no sense. And this case made no sense. She studied Langley's body first. No wounds, no signs of poison, just a man who looked frozen in time. Then she turned her attention to the 4 men standing stiffly around the table. "All right, gentlemen," she said, her voice cool. "Tell me what happened." One by one, they told her the same story. They were playing poker. Langley placed a large bet. The lights flickered. A loud noise. Langley collapsed. No one saw what happened. Carter narrowed her eyes. "And no one left their seat?" "No one," Thomas said firmly. "And yet," she tapped the table, "a man is dead, and I don't see a single weapon." Her gaze moved to Langley's final poker hand. 4 aces and a king. "Strange," she murmured. "Quite the lucky hand." The 4 men said nothing, but inside, each of them was wondering the same thing. Was Langley's death really a murder? Or something even stranger? The first clue. The forensics team combed through the room, checking every possible hiding place for a weapon. Nothing, no gun, no knife, no poison. And then, just as Carter was about to ask more questions, one of the officers called out, "Detective, you need to see this." He was standing near Langley's chair, pointing at something underneath the table. Carter crouched down, and her eyes darkened. A small, hidden mechanism. She pressed it lightly, and there was a soft click. The seat shifted slightly. Carter straightened, looking at the 4 men. "Gentlemen, I think Mr. Langley was trying to pull a trick on you." Detective Carter tapped her fingers on the table, staring at the hidden mechanism beneath Langley's chair. "Someone care to explain what this is?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. The 4 men exchanged uneasy glances. None of them had ever seen anything like it before. One of the forensic officers crouched down and examined the mechanism closer. He pulled out a small flashlight and ran it along the underside of the chair. Then he found it. A thin wire ran from the chair's armrest to the table leg, where it connected to a hidden spring-loaded trigger. "This was rigged," the officer muttered. "Looks like it was meant to activate something." Carter straightened, the gears turning in her mind. "All right," she said slowly. "Let's go over this one more time." Langley places his bet. He leans forward, the lights flicker, there's a loud noise, and then he collapses. Her sharp eyes studied each man. And yet, no one actually saw a weapon. Vincent spoke up, his voice steady but laced with tension. "That's because there wasn't one." Carter's gaze snapped to him. "What do you mean?" Vincent let out a slow breath. Langley was a gambler, but he was also a cheat. He was losing money fast, and he knew it. If I had to guess, he rigged this chair to make it look like he had been taken out. Maybe to escape his debts or to stage something dramatic. Carter considered this. It made sense, but something still didn't add up. "Then why is he actually dead?" she asked. A heavy silence filled the room. Then the forensic officer cleared his throat. "Detective, you might want to see this." He held up a tiny, empty syringe. It had been hidden inside the chair. Carter took the syringe and turned it over in her fingers. The needle was thin, barely noticeable, but just enough to deliver something deadly into the bloodstream. She looked at the 4 men, her expression unreadable. Someone knew about Langley's trick. Thomas, Leonard, Daniel, and Vincent all remained silent. Carter exhaled, shaking her head. "All right, let's put the pieces together." Langley planned to fake his own death. He had the chair rigged to make a loud noise and collapse dramatically. But before he could pull off the stunt, someone else beat him to it. They knew what he was planning and planted this syringe in his chair, so when he activated the mechanism... She paused, watching the realization dawn on their faces. He poisoned himself, without even knowing it. Carter studied each man carefully. Someone in this room made sure Langley never got up from that chair. The question is, who? Her eyes landed on Daniel. His face was pale. His fingers twitched slightly at his sides. "You knew, didn't you?" Carter said softly. Daniel's mouth opened, but no words came out. The room felt colder. "Langley ruined you once before. He made you lose everything in a rigged game years ago. Tonight you saw him setting up another trick, and you decided to make sure it would be his last." Daniel took a slow step back. I didn't... Carter sighed. You didn't have to. You let him do the work for you. He thought he was cheating all of you, but the real trick was on him." A long pause. Then Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "He always said the house never loses." His eyes flickered to Langley's final poker hand. 4 aces and a king. Looks like he was right. The officer stepped forward, placing handcuffs around Daniel's wrists. He didn't resist. As he was led out of the room, the remaining 3 men exhaled, as if releasing a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. Carter picked up the cards Langley had been holding. She studied them for a moment before placing them back on the table. Game over. Hours later, the poker table remained untouched. The cards still lay scattered across the felt surface, Langley's final hand frozen in time. The irony was almost poetic. Langley thought he had everything under control. He thought he could gamble his way out of anything. But in the end, he lost the one game he couldn't afford to lose. And as the last officers left, the words lingered in the air like a ghost. The house always wins. Some bets are too high. Some games can't be won. And sometimes, the deadliest opponent is the one staring back at you in the mirror. If you enjoyed this mystery, hit that subscribe button for more mind-blowing stories.